All right, everybody, welcome back to another week of Striper Migration Reports from On the Water. My name is Matt Haeffner. I'm the assistant editor at On the Water magazine, and you probably know that already if you've watched the past five videos that we've done. This is week 6 of our 14-week video series, so this will carry us through June 29th or 30th, I believe. And we're going to jump right into the migration this week after giving you a brief recap of what happened in last week's video. So last week we were joined by Captain Brian Williams of Badfish Charters in Ocean City, New Jersey, and Brian discussed the current class of stripers in southern New Jersey, how to approach larger migratory fish as they continue to arrive in the first 2 weeks of May, as well as being aware of subtle indicators of fish when the bite gets tough. Could be a few egrets on a salt marsh, a few cormorants diving, and how that could be a game changer when you're looking for a bite. Then we skipped on up to Middletown, Rhode Island to talk with Peter Jenkins of the Saltwater Edge. Peter gave some great insight as to how to set yourself up for success in the spring by keeping a log, having a plan B, and knowing when to call it quits in the estuaries and target those bigger fish out front. We even talked a little bit about the constant changes in weather this spring and how that may or may not have impacted striper spawning conditions. Since last week, more and bigger bass, some pushing 30 pounds, have hit the south shore of Long Island and the beaches of New Jersey, while the south shore of Massachusetts, the outer Cape beaches, and Cape Cod Bay received an uptick in migratory schoolie action in a lot of the salt ponds and the bays. But this week, we're heading down to eastern Long Island, where schoolie and overslot stripers have been trickling in for the past 2 weeks. Then we'll be making a quick jump across the Long Island Sound to check in on Connecticut's spring run and the class of fish in the rivers versus the class of fish out on the beaches. Our first guest this week is a renowned author. He's a YouTube fishing video guru and one of the most knowledgeable surfcasters I've ever had the pleasure of speaking to. Please welcome John Skinner. All right, everybody. So we got John Skinner here. John is a well-known author and surfcaster from Long Island. He's also a big kayak fisherman if you've seen any of his recent videos. So John, how are you?
Very good.
Good to have you. I know you kind of just got back from wintering in Florida, and it's been pretty cold this spring compared to the past couple seasons up here in the Northeast, which I'm sure is a bit of an adjustment for you at first. But since your return to New York, have you noticed anything out of the ordinary going on in the first week, going into the first week of May, as far as like back bay water temps, bait presence, or abundance of fish on the North Fork?
Yeah, just like stupidly cold, because I am out on the tip of the North Fork, and it's way different than Western Long Island. And yeah, Friday morning it was 34 degrees. Saturday morning was 38 degrees. The air temperatures, and that no way the water is warming up with temperatures like that. And even
Right.
earlier in the week, I was complaining that it was 40, but that was good by the end of the week. So yeah, I mean, when we came up, it was about 10 days ago or whatever it was. Yeah, I mean, we're driving up and it was still 70 when we hit Long Island, and then all of a sudden, it just got cold. So
Yeah.
from what I'm seeing, at least where I am, it definitely depressed fishing because the water's cold and things are just kind of quiet. Now, was it Friday we took the boat and went to Jessup's Neck? I mean, everybody knows about that spot.
Yeah.
I'm not spot burning there, which is in the Peconics, so a little to the west. And yeah, and that was decent. I mean, it was. I'd never seen it so quiet because usually there's birds and fish busting, and there was very, very little of that. But we did catch like 8 bass, and we had some
Big
slots, and we had one on that was over slot that we had alongside the boat. And yeah, so that, certainly I bet by now, I mean, that was Friday, today's Tuesday, right? So
Yeah.
I would imagine when we go back out next time, which is probably tomorrow, it's going to be probably a lot different.
Yeah, a few more days of sunshine, and we've had a lot of gray days and some like northeast and southeast winds that just keep everything cold and kind of keeps the fish at bay a little bit. So
Yeah, no, it's
a little bit
54
warmer
degrees
weather.
out right now at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah,
Yeah, and cloudy, and yeah, but that's all right. It'll all come.
yeah, it'll heat up exactly. So I saw your first YouTube video back on the island the other day, and you got into some nice schoolie stripers from your kayak. But for people who maybe haven't seen your video yet or are not familiar with your channel even, can you describe kind of what features or indicators you were looking for that helped you locate those first few fish of the season?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for a spot where I'm well back bay, and stuff that can warm up a little faster. But again, how can you warm up when you're not seeing 50 degrees, which is what it was last week. It was hardly seeing 50. And I think I had 52-degree water, but that almost seemed like impossible since we weren't getting any air up that high unless It had been from previous weather before I came back from Florida, but yeah, so I've got some spots there, Back Bay, and you just look for an area where you've got some water flow, and usually these things work. But and I had some fish, um, but certainly wasn't hot and heavy action.
Right. And I noticed during the video, you were throwing bucktails, and I know you spend a lot of time throwing bucktails, especially during those first few weeks of the spring when those fish are often pinned to the bottom. So, what areas do you find most conducive to fishing a bucktail in the spring? Like, what features are you looking for?
Oh, channels, creeks, stuff that drains, or especially if you can fish outgoing water, draining those backwater areas that tend to warm up a little faster. But you know, uh, I like to fish daybreak, and the tides were not conducive to that, even because it was incoming in the morning. But
Right.
it was still a little action. But I have to tell you, even when it went outgoing a few days later, and I hit that pattern, it was terribly slow. Yeah,
Mm.
surprisingly.
So, have you noticed any fish with sea lice in your area yet?
I did notice, and I can't remember where that fish was, whether it was one of those on that video or whether it was in Jessops. It was probably in Jessops because
Yeah.
certainly there's migratories going into there. Yeah.
Right, right up into the river and stuff. I always wondered how far up the Peconic. I mean, I know it's pretty dammed up, but I know, they follow the herring up there, so it's just exactly how far do they go up, and do you think there's a small spawning population in the Peconic by any chance?
I know there's winter over fish for
Yeah.
sure because I used to when I worked closer to that, I used to hit that early in the season and catch fish there, but they were small, and you needed a warm day, and I'm sure those are winter over. Whether there's spawners in there, yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Right, right. Well, so I mean, you still got a lot of residents out in the Peconic Bay area right now, but as the migration continues, can you give us an idea of when you'll start to see those fish transition from feeding in the bays and the harbors and inlets into kind of open water and even the deep rips of the Eastern Sound?
The migration is strange to me, or mysterious, in that I'm talking about, oh, gee, we seem to be lagging behind, stuff's just coming in. Yet I read, you guys have got reports about migratory fish pouring into Massachusetts, Rhode Island
Yeah,
within the last week. So it's not strictly a south to north lighting up of the action.
right.
Stuff comes in, and I understand stuff like the river herring or alewives, whatever you want to call them. Certainly plays into that. Squid plays into that,
Oh, definitely.
and but certainly by around May 10th or so, we'll have fish in plum gut. So if you're
Mhm.
talking about migratory deep rip, that's plum gut, the race. Certainly by May 10th, they'll be coming through that. That's just a pattern that they're on for sure.
Yep. And so in places like Plum Gut, I've spent some time the past couple of summers going out to the race and Plum Gut and three-weighing bucktails. And I know you've done your fair amount of that, but do you tend to shift to targeting those fish with flutter spoons when they're in the deep rips?
I do both, but nowadays I really try, if I can get them on the spoons, if the bluefish aren't heavy in there, I'll use the spoons because amazing job of culling out the bigger fish. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, remarkable actually. So if I can fish spoons, fish spoons, yeah.
Yeah, well, if you're using a 7 to 9 inch profile, I mean, it's bound to weed out some of those, schoolies that stack up in there, or even some of the, cocktail racer blues that are in there with them.
Well, it doesn't weed out the bluefish. I mean, no, they put an end to that fishing. Once they're in there, because they'll just cut your spoons off all the time. So,
Yeah.
and I fish 80-pound leader, like fluoro leader material ahead of those spoons, and the bluefish go right through that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, last year I was down there and we had nothing but bluefish out there. And it was they were very keyed in on sand eels. So we were getting them on diamond jigs and slow pitch jigs and stuff like that, but very few bass around. So hopefully that changes this year.
well, it all depends when you were in there. Early on, it's
Yeah.
pretty solid bass, and
Okay.
I just hope it would be nice to see the big ones in there again. Like 2 years ago, it was just phenomenal. The quality of the bass on the spoons, like 20 to 30 pounds. I've got a video on my channel where it's the first time I was using the flutter spoons, which made it even that much more interesting. Uh, I barely knew what I was doing with the spoon, and it was one big fish after another.
Yeah.
but last year not as many large ones in there. But it's always that's a fun fishery. I'm sure
Oh
you've done
yeah.
it. Yeah, it's a lot of fun in there. Yeah.
It is a blast. But 2 years ago, you were mentioning, the big fish that were up in the Eastern Sound, and I lost a fish that is still haunting me in my nightmares to this day. It was I was out with Rich Jensen on the Nancy Ann,
Mhm.
and we were three-weighing bucktails, and just one of those fish you just couldn't stop. So
Yeah.
hoping to
Wow.
get back out there and do that again this year. So last thing I wanted to ask you would be if you could offer one piece of parting advice to striped bass anglers over the next week, what would it be?
You're watching the weather and reacting to that, and trying to find if you can fish outgoing and try to get those sunny days or after a sunny day where it's warming up backwaters, and if you can fish outgoing, that's a good thing. That's one of the things. And keep your eyes out for like if you see some adult bunker around, have some bigger plugs ready. Even keep an eye on the ospreys. They'll pluck adult bunker out that you don't even know are there. So keep
Right.
an eye on them. You see that action, you definitely want to throw a larger offering once in a while.
Yep, yep. We've heard from guys in the past couple striper migration reports that birds are a great indicator of where there's bait, and where there's bait, there's usually some fish early on in the spring. And you mentioned the outgoing tide as well. And this past week, based on my logs since I moved to Cape Cod, I had been targeting my estuary spots on the incoming tide because in the past 2 years, that's where I did very well on the
Mm-hmm.
incoming tide. But last night I changed it up. I went on the outgoing, and I had fish breaking all over the surface for the first hour and a half I was there. So sometimes it is just shifting up when you're going out and hitting the water, and keeping an eye on the tides and the weather.
Right, and I'm sure you had a warm day yesterday, right? I mean, at one point,
It was.
we had 77 degrees here in the North Fork, which
That's
was
beautiful.
unbelievable compared to what it had been. But of course, within hours, it was back in the mid 50s. It was amazing how fast it dropped, and it hasn't recovered.
Yeah, that wind shifted. We got a
Yep.
southeast wind today, and it's nice and cold now, and it's gray, and it's funny. Sometimes I think of striper fishing. I want the overcast days where they can't see as
Yeah.
well. But after all the cold weather we've had and the gray, cloudy skies, you kind of want those warmer days to bring those fish up to the surface and get them going a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that first video I posted. I rarely do a video on two trips. I mean, it's always, it's a trip video,
Right.
but I put two trips up because it was a cool contrast where the first one was absolutely perfectly clear, bright sunshine, and I had some action once I found them. And then the next day, well, I knew where they were, right? So I went right back to that area, almost dead, but it was overcast. It was heavy
Noticed
overcast,
that. Yep.
even drizzled a little bit. And those fish just, I was like, oh, I could use some sunshine, which I never think of when I'm
Yeah.
striper fishing. I mean,
Me
I
too.
love those cloudy days, but that was a case where the sun unquestionably helped.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to send people to your video. We'll put the link to it in the description of the YouTube video so people can go find your channel if they haven't seen that video already. And hope you enjoy the rest of the spring migration, John. I really appreciate you jumping on.
All right, you too, catch them up out there.
All right, thanks. Will do. All right, big thanks to John Skinner again for giving us an update on the migration in his neck of the woods on Long Island's North Fork. If you haven't subscribed to John's YouTube channel, we'll put a link in the description to his channel so you can watch all of his videos. I also highly recommend reading his books, Fishing the Bucktail, Striper Pursuit, which I have right here, and Fishing the Edge. I'm finishing up Striper Pursuit for the second time. It's a super technical book with a lot of helpful notes and reminders that will undoubtedly help you improve your fishing. So check those books out as well. Now we're going to skip across the Long Island Sound for our next guest. He's an avid kayak fisherman, an Old Town pro. He's a manager at Black Hall Outfitters in Westbrook, Connecticut, and a contributing writer of On the Waters. Please welcome Matt Stone. All right, everybody. So we got Matt Stone here. He's an avid kayak fisherman. He's an Old Town pro, as a matter of fact, and he works at Black Hall Outfitters in Westbrook, Connecticut. Matt, how are you doing?
Doing great, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I happy to talk to you about, a little bit about resident stripers, but also about the migratory fish that have been trickling in over the past few weeks. So you guys have had a couple of small waves of stripers making their way up the coast, but Connecticut is also known for its robust holdover fishery. So I'm curious, how do you approach fishing for those spring residents in tidal portions of Connecticut's rivers versus the migratory fish you find out front this time of year?
Yeah, for a lot of the, winter slash early spring fishing, we're doing a lot of stuff that's going to present an easy meal for those fish. my first striper this year was on January 2nd, which was kind of cool. It was very cold. But it's
Yeah.
wild to see those fish in 5 feet of water, back up in the tidal creeks and things like that. So I'm doing a lot of Lunker City finesse fish was a big one for me this year, the 5 3/4.
Yeah.
A lot of gravity tackle paddle tails, low and slow. And then more recently, we've been able to do a little bit of faster moving stuff, some Daiwa SP minnow action. And now that the herring are really kind of cruising around out there, I've been able to get a little bit of top water action on some very small spook baits as well. So we're basically during the holdover fishery looking for, pods of fish. It's truly one of those times in the winter I find where 90% of the fish are in 10% of the water. It seems like they're really tight together. And so once you find them, they might be concentrated on a 30-yard section of shoreline. But because it's winter, even then you're not guaranteed to get any. So a few fish in the winter is a good day.
How has the recent rain impact fishing in the rivers for you?
Yeah, so our bigger rivers are really susceptible, obviously, to rain. And what's tricky sometimes is it could be a storm in Vermont. And a few days later, we are, chocolate milk brown. So we saw that last summer. We had that massive flooding event that really caused some tragic damage up in Vermont, and that turned the mouth of the Connecticut River Ovaltine for better part of 2 weeks. So the smaller creeks, they tend to kind of recover a little quicker, and because they have less pouring into them, they don't really have as much of a murk factor on those heavy rain events. But it's definitely something that you kind of have to be a very amateur meteorologist if you really want to dive into the migration and the location of these fish, which I actually kind of enjoy meteorology a little bit. So it's fun tracking that and seeing how that all goes.
Yeah, it puts you at an advantage. And so when you're fishing for holdovers in the rivers, up until I guess the first week of May, you're probably still finding fish in the rivers. What areas are you looking for? Are you looking for like deep holes or kind of like shallow flats that are adjacent to a channel or something like that?
Yeah, I for the most part, I'm starting in holes. They tend to congregate there and stick their bellies in the mud a little bit.
Yeah.
So they do. I find on sunny days they will move up into the shallow flats. In fact, a couple times recently, over the past, sometime a couple weeks in March, I was describing to my buddies like it's almost like freshwater bass fishing. Like I was just beating the banks,
Right.
and waiting until I found a few. And it's also one of those times where like side imaging is super crucial. In those 10 foot and shallower tidal creeks, it really helps you pinpoint where those fish are, because this time of year, if you're marking a decent mark back there, it's very likely, a striper. So you can kind of help pinpoint them with the side imaging as well.
Cool. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you is I know you just mentioned you've been catching stripers since what was it, January 2nd or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we just talked to John Skinner, and he's in Florida during the winter, so he's not targeting holdovers or anything like that. So he's had a slower start to striper fishing this spring, and he mentioned that around May 10th he starts looking for some of those bigger bass in the deep rips of the Eastern Sound. So what class of fish are you generally seeing in the Sound this week, and what do you think will change come the end of that first full week of May?
Yeah, so right now our resident fish are primarily, in the 20-inch to 25-inch range. A 30-incher in winter is really good. That one I got in January was 34, which was really surprising. But most of them, the vast majority, are smaller, schoolie sized fish. You will see as the herring come in, we do obviously get some bass that tend to follow them. If you are a guy who fishes a herring run, by the second week of May, it's not uncommon to see 30, 35-inch bass, tight around those herring runs. Last year, I think I got my first really sizable topwater fish around the third week of May, right near a herring run.
Yeah.
And so that really is, we'll get those waves like you talked about earlier. There's the herring wave, and then as much as sometimes looking back on it, it feels like a light switch, like we didn't have the big bass, then we did. If you really, dial into it, there are definitely trickles and waves. And, if you see a 40-inch fish swipe at your plug in May, it's impossible unless you land it to know if it came from the ocean and had lice or if it was just an active holdover fish.
Right.
We do get dropbacks, which I got one a few years ago that was really sort of my first experience with a true drop back. It was like a 38-inch fish, but it was about as wide as a 23-inch fish. You know, it was a really
Yeah,
skinny fish that you could tell was getting ready to bulk up once those bunker arrived. But
sure.
yeah, usually, you know, May is really a catalyst type month for us. We're kind of on the eve of waiting for those bunker to arrive. We will get trickles of the bigger fish. But luckily, you know, being where we are, there's only a few ways to get into the sound.
Right.
So we tend to get some warning bells, you know, once the Montauk guys start banging fish, once the New Haven guys start banging fish, that's when we can start here in the Central Sound to really kind of have our eyes open and really feel like there may be a wave incoming.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'm glad you just mentioned the presence of herring and bunker because, you know, on the Cape and in many other portions of the Striper Coast, herring are such a staple in the diet of spring stripers. And I know Connecticut's herring runs aren't quite what they used to be in terms of quantity, but do you find that their presence influences your techniques for those larger migratory bass that might start showing up in May, or is the fishing more focused around bunker schools in places like the mouth of the Connecticut River?
Yeah, I think definitely for us right now, it's very herring focused. I think too, you have the ability to kind of mimic any sort of herring-sized fish like mummies or you know something like that that those fish have maybe been feeding on over the winter time. But I've been throwing like the anchovy-colored Lunker City finesse fish. It's just a brown kind of brown striped pearl belly kind of
Yeah.
deal that you know anything like that is working. We've been selling one of my favorite colors of the Daiwa SP Minnow is Hickory Dickory,
Yeah.
and that's kind of got it's great. It's like pearl white, but it has spots on the side, so it could be a bunker, you know, at certain points in the year. But it also has sort of a purpley back, so it could also be a little bit of a herring there.
Yeah.
So you know, if I do see osprey diving on herring and things like that, it's definitely going to be influencing where I fish for sure.
Right.
And you do get the tendency to, you know, you get kind of that courage to try a bigger bait if you do see definitive signs of herring, because especially as the, you know, as we push into the second and third week of May, there's a good chance that there's some big bass around them too.
And so when do you make that shift to fishing, you know, almost exclusively out front and why?
Yeah, so our initial run here in the Central Sound is very much when the bunker schools hit kind of our major rivers. And that bite for us will last, you know, who knows when they kind of initially really start to show. Last year, I think it was like this, like the 10th or so of June, where it
Okay.
was really like, you know, you really knew that there were big bunker schools, big bass in the river. And that lasted until till about the 4th of July, which is right around when it usually lasts until.
Gotcha.
And at some point, you know, those bunker pull the fish in, and then once that temperature in the river gets a little uncomfortable for those bigger bass, the majority of them, some stick around, but the majority of them tend to dump out. I call it out front, like out into the reefs and the points and things
Right.
like
Yeah.
that. And that's really where I think the Central and the Eastern Sound shines during the summer months because we do have that fresh inflow of water coming from the race. You know, we're directly across from that. So whereas certain parts of the Sound can get a little warmer for those bigger fish, we make a pretty good summer home for them with all the food and then the nice, clean, clear water that comes through during the hot summer months.
Definitely. I would say the Western Sound is it's definitely one of those warmer, you know, pockets where they're not going to be hanging around as much. And you know, some of
Yep.
that structure and the rips of the Eastern Sound are great for those bass to just hold up for the summer if they're not making the run
Mhm.
to places like the Cape or Block Island or things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, and you do see that block fishery really kind of turn on as well in those summer months when those fish, you know, I think want that cooler water out there deeper. Yeah, for sure.
So for our kayak fishing listeners, if you could give like one suggestion or key piece of advice to offer as we head into the height of the spring migration, what would it be?
I would say definitely be willing to explore. It's really easy to sit around and wait until that initial bite, then when you know everybody knows that all the fish are here. But if you're really passionate about it and you really want to find action, you might have to drive a little bit. You might have to launch in a couple spots. I've been skunked so many times this winter just to get a bite or two, but there is a lot more action available than most folks think, and it doesn't start, you know, in mid-June. It's kind of it's happening right now. You know,
Yeah.
if you want a topwater striper locally, you can get it. You just really have to poke around and you know, just try to think like those fish. Where if you're one of those first few fish to arrive, or one of the first few kind of waking up after winter, where do you want to go and what do you want to be around? So yeah, definitely be willing. And I think, if I was to add a second little tidbit in there, especially for the May and June fishery, if you're a kayak guy, get good side imaging. Those fish travel in wolf packs, they bunch up. Bunker schools are easy to see on the side imaging. And in the summer, not as much, but in the spring, man, a lot of times you're seeing those fish. Oh, they're 40 or so feet off my right side. Yep,
Right.
Here we go. Bam. It's really helpful.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned again, kind of poking around and trying to find some newer spots and kind of thinking like a fish, like a migratory fish would, because and it goes back to what you said initially about, being a little bit of a kind of meteorologist and kind of keeping your eye on the conditions, especially this spring where it's been really cold and kind of gray and northeast and southeast winds. I was talking with John Skinner about it. That will really give you, a couple hints as to where the more likely options are to find fish with warmer water, bait presence, things like that.
Yeah. This is definitely, whereas last year was very much a warmer March and April. This year it has been, I was saying to a buddy of mine at the shop, it's not necessarily even that here it's been really, really cold, but we've not had a lot of sun, and you really need that sun to warm up that water. And, even if the high is, like, today's a great example, it's 55, but it's been cloudy all day, that's not going to do much for the water temperature or, things like that. So it's been an interesting year, and we are, I think, I just got back, I spent the morning out tog fishing, and usually I get 2 or 3 good weeks of tog. And today I got, a little over a dozen fish, and that was my first time catching more than 3. And I think, we just feel like we're maybe a little bit behind this year, whereas last year it felt like we were, maybe a little bit in fast forward mode because of all that warmth. So you really, it's fun to nerd out about the reasons behind why fish are active or not active. And I think it's part of what makes it fun,
Yeah, theorizing a little bit, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, this has been great, Matt. Thank you so much for jumping on. I really appreciate all the insight you gave to fishing the Connecticut rivers and then out front in the Sound as the migration progresses. And best of luck to you. Hopefully, you can catch more stripers than you did tog.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I hope so too.
All right, anytime, Matt. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks a lot.
Yes, sir.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for this week. A huge thanks again to both John Skinner and Matt Stone for jumping on to discuss the striper migration around eastern Long Island, the Sound, and the shores of Connecticut. The theme of a slow, strange start to the spring migration continued this week, but as John Skinner said, it's just a matter of time until we get some prolonged sunshine and warm weather to set things fully in motion. And like Matt Stone touched on, despite cold water and air temperatures, stripers in Connecticut are taking topwater offerings in the rivers and bays if you time your outings well with an outgoing tide and some sunshine, even though sunshine has been hard to come by. But the migration continues despite whatever conditions Mother Nature throws at us. And as of this week, schoolies have officially traveled as far north as Boston. It's a smaller biomass of fish that has begun to spread out across Massachusetts' South Shore, with some of those fish even peeling off into Cape Cod Bay after passing through the canal. There's also been an increase in the class of stripers running around Buzzards Bay, so keep your eyes on the Cape Cod Canal this weekend. And if you're not hitting the canal, it's worth checking out the rips in Vineyard and Nantucket Sounds, where squid should be filtering in by the day. Rhode Island anglers should also be on the lookout for squid, with stripers hot on their tails. We're seeing bass up to 30 pounds in certain areas of Long Island South Shore, and as we discussed with Mike Gleason a few weeks back, some of those larger Chesapeake fish will be pulling up off the coast of New Jersey over the next week or two. And there's no better time than now, before the cows come home, to sign up for On the Water's Striper Cup. It's a 20-week catch and release based striped bass fishing tournament where you can win weekly prizes from big name brands just for catching and photographing your fish. And if Striper Cup is not for you, that's okay. You can also join the Rapala Lures photo contest that just began on May 1st, which will award 12 anglers with Yeti gear for catching and photographing a striped bass caught on any Rapala lure. If you've signed up for the Striper Cup already, you're one step ahead of the game with the Rapala X-Rap Longcast that was included in your Striper Cup sign-up package. Check out Striper Cup on Instagram to learn more about the photo contest, and go to stripercup.com to sign up for the cup. Best of luck to everybody out there fishing this week. Thanks again for watching, and tune in next week for another Striper Migration Report from On the Water.